In a world of complex and overwhelming challenges, the Inspirational Insights podcast provides a shift in perspective. Dive into the minds of brilliant thinkers, creatives, and edge-riding leaders who have adapted their thinking and leadership practices to match today's perplexing challenges. Your host, Dawna Jones, leads captivating conversations with trailblazers from diverse fields who have transcended tough and complex conditions to contribute to a healthier world. Can we collectively break old habits to reinvent the human work-earth relationship and support the vitality and diversity of all life? Harnessing agility, embracing possibilities. Welcome to the journey.
What will the future of the world look like? Unlocking human potential. First, what are we talking about when we talk about human potential? In 1968, 69, we were just putting the first man on the moon. Now we're flying off the planet. There's been a lot that's happened. During COVID, when there was a big crisis, more things happened in 7 months than happened in 7 years, by many people's estimations. When we ask ourselves, what will the future look like? The answers are complex because it depends on how we think about it. When we think about 2 years or 3 years, that is pretty much extrapolation. What's today and how does it look like tomorrow? In this episode, I'm going to look at what influences the future, the design of the future, how we can think about it, and at the end, I'll be inviting you to participate in a futuring workshop where we can put some ideas together. My name is Dawna Jones. I've been podcasting since 2008 with the aim to bring into perspective different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing the world, so that we can work together to create and handle some of the bigger issues that challenge vitality of life on this planet, this incredible planet that we live on today. First of all, the future of the world is up to each of us and all of us. There's an overwhelming temptation to look to government, to look to anybody but ourselves in the mirror and say, well, they need to solve it. Business needs to solve it. When I first started podcasting in 2008, I believed that business could solve it. There was real potential for companies to take a strong leadership role. Out of all of them, the only one that's done the hard work and had the difficult conversations is Patagonia. That's the only one that's made it to the level of planetary consciousness. So what does that mean for the rest? Well, it means that business can't lead without a whole lot of people helping them do that. And so that puts it back to local people, puts it back to citizens. Some things work for us. What works for us is the issues are complex. They are gnarly and they beg a different approach. And that means we can bring online a stronger and wider and more diverse set of intelligences than we've previously taken the opportunity to do. Previously, we've just looked at things linearly, very sequentially. Input plus process equals output. That thought process, it's causal in character, but it's also wasteful. We've thrown an awful lot of planetary resources out. I recall in 2014, I did a slide deck on this. And at that time, there were more rare earth minerals in landfills than in all known global reserves. Those global reserves are largely in Africa, and they've already been claimed by China and some other countries. The rare earth minerals we've been throwing out are the ones we need for our tech. They're the ones that operate your phone. I asked Perplexity AI how much of the world's e-waste contains rare earth minerals. The answer came back, the total amount of rare earth elements in e-waste in 2022 was approximately 12 million kilograms or 12,000 metric tons. The question around who owns the most of these reserves and who owns the actual global reserves, not in landfill, it is China at the top and then Russia. The potential and the importance of harvesting or at least not throwing away stuff we value is pretty high, but it's going to have to be mined in a completely different way. The thinking that created the situation is clearly not the same thinking that will fix it. In rare earth minerals, 1 ton of printed circuit boards contains at least 200 kilograms of copper, 0.4 kilograms of silver, and 0.09 kilograms of gold, with concentrations of precious metals potentially 10 times higher than in natural ones. This comes from Perplexity AI, which is what I often go to for some of my research, of course, knowing that not all of it's going to be accurate, but at least it gives you some idea of the situation. The linear thinking that's characterized the past, if we do this, then this will happen, doesn't match complex issues or situations. Let's face it, the issues are complex, poverty is complex, all the threats that face the existence of civilization. We have the opportunity to do better than we have in the past, but it won't take linear thinking. So what's the option? Well, the option could be nonlinear thinking, just coming out of a completely random, very creative approach. Put those two together and you have something more powerful. So that's the first thing we've got going for us. Diversity of thinking, both in terms of neurodivergence and thought divergence. Nature is a complex adaptive system. Our bodies are complex. There's trillions of cells working together to keep us healthy. We either help it or we don't, depending on how aware we are and how much ownership and engagement we have with living our lives and the sense of control we have over living your life. The second thing we've got going for us is that it's a challenge. Why is that nice? Well, first of all, the skills to step up a notch and take on that challenge are not the skills most people have today. So it means growth. It means stepping up. And these are often the flow states that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talked about in his book, Flow. It is that peak performance state. It's that place, that feel-good moment. You're at prime peak. I've certainly experienced this, particularly when riding horses, and it just felt like we were doing this lovely dance and floating around. We may have only been trotting or cantering, but the communication and connection between me and the horse took us into a different space. Anybody that's ever ridden in a horse may have come across that feeling of unity, that feeling of just complete cooperation and communication. But it obviously is a much broader and wider feeling, that sense of flow. We've an opportunity to experience flow using the challenges we've got today, not pretending that they're simple. They're not. They're complex. You may be able to use some simple unifying principles to make life easier, but you can't diminish them into one answer. It will be multiple answers because it's like different dots on the matrix. Third thing that we've got going for us is a very wide spectrum of experience across generations. And that can easily be overlooked because sometimes experience and wisdom are assumed to be chronological. They're not. On my podcast, I have a 28-year-old who's wiser than most people walking around in their 60s and 70s. Why? Well, because he's been through a very difficult experience and he came through it with a greater sense of wholeness. He came through it by pulling together his creative resources. He came through it by tapping into his aliveness and vitality, seeing the world as a life force versus something to exploit or consume as a means to deal with emotional depletion. We can work across generations much more effectively than we do right now. I think that's one dimension of human potential that we have not yet played with. We're still tinkering around and pointing fingers. So let's go to what things we have working against us. Logically, the first thing we have working against us is the separation between generations. Not just that, but the separation that has a judgment attached to it. As in, if you're different, you need to be marginalized because we're looking for people that conform, not independent thinkers. That works against us entirely because we need divergence before we can converge on anything. We need a very wide spectrum of experience, age, thought, separating us all into either age categories or generational descriptors. While it's useful to say, okay, that's a boomer, I'm a boomer, this person is that, nobody's made the same way. As soon as you start labeling something, you stop being curious. If there's one thing you need when you're facing fear, it's your curiosity because you want to know what to be afraid of and why. And then you know how to deal with it. But at the moment, we have fear of absolutely everything. In order for us to really achieve our full potential, in order to design a future that has vitality, we're going to need to get over fear and become a whole lot more curious about what the world offers. The separation of generations into groups that mark differences comes a loss of curiosity to find out, well, how can these differences work together? What does someone who's highly creative bring to a company who is stuck in their old ways, fighting hard to retain the certainty that they had in the past that no longer exists? This is a chance for us to find out how to embrace human potential that is sitting on the sidelines because their thinking is not conforming to the norm. It is challenging the norm, and that's a healthy process. The third thing then that works against us is the entire paradigm shift from using force as a way to move forward and through things to making life-affirming decisions. All of our systems and processes are based on manipulating and controlling the environment, whether it's the environment in ourselves, whether it's the environment at a workplace, or the wider social and ecological environment. They're all based on using force and manipulation. Companies do this all the time. If you don't match up to a certain level, then you're quickly dispensed with because you haven't met your targets. And no one goes to say, hey, what's going on for you? How are you doing? Can we help?
One of the reasons why we cannot rely on government to solve some of these big problems is quite simply because they're not up to the thought process. I've observed that municipal decision-making is close to the bottom rung of decision-making consciousness because it goes by legal and not by ethical parameters. There are companies, of course, that do neither. They fall below municipal decision-making. The opportunity then is to become much more aware of what we're basing the decisions on, why, and how to adapt those decisions to match the context we're in. I don't have a lot of hope for municipal decision-making to actually do what they say they value. For example, they say that they value the values of community, but in no way does the decision-making process reflect how the values of the community are being factored into the decision. It's more limited by, is it legal or isn't it legal? So if you're looking for leadership in that front, unlikely to find it. A lot of these decisions then get based on what we believe to be true, and that simply recycles the past. So you're not going to find the future in the belief that what worked before is going to work going forward. That's one way we can sabotage ourselves in designing a future that works for all. There's been some interesting work done by Jay Bragdon, who's an investment advisor, looking at the design of economies that have the most progressive models to be able to adapt and the principles that allow for the complexity that characterizes everything, characterizes life. Lots of insight to be found there. Global institutions like the UN and so forth are still very linear in their thinking. And so we're not going to see much movement there unless it's broadened and opened and a more creative process is incorporated. That opportunity exists and has existed for quite some time. It's a matter of just whether or not it gets built into the process. If it were, it would be extremely interesting and exciting. Meanwhile, a lot of the global institutions are very much working with linear decision-making, which constitutes and creates a pretty high risk. And it's not terribly effective. When I look at the question of what will the future of the world look like, I would suggest that to get there, we will definitely have to update and upgrade the level of decision-making awareness, not what's in it for me, but into how can we be of service to clients, to the customer. If you're a company, how can we be of service to the planet? If you're a foresighted company and a responsible company, these are the kinds of questions that will determine what the future of the world will look like. And they're questions we each need to ask and all need to ask. So when I hear about companies making big layoffs, I can't help but ask myself, I wonder if they went to their people and said, hey, looks like we're going to have to do this. This is one option. What other options can you offer or suggest that would cut our cost? Many times when companies are looking at doing layoffs, they rattle the entire nervous system of the organization by claiming layoffs are the solution, when in fact, with some creative thinking and a different approach, that's not necessarily the solution, because it is one half of the bottom line. There's always this focus on cutting costs when in fact you could be saving money. Global pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk asked the question, how can we save energy, increase profits while investing in renewable energy? It's a three-pronged question, and it's not an easy one to answer. This is the question they put to their staff with the audacious goal to cut CO2 emissions by an absolute 10% from global production sites within 10 years. Within 5 years, that goal was achieved. So this is what happens when you engage people in designing their future and you've developed trust and understanding and a strong sense of belonging. You can't be operating in the what's in it for me level of consciousness or mentality. You have to care about something much bigger than yourself. They see themselves as being part of the wider system. Therefore, they ask those questions and they're not afraid of the answers. Here's an example of municipal decision-making, what a linear decision-making process looks like that is working from a very narrow point of view.
Municipal decision-making, in my observation, is at the bottom rung of decision-making because it goes by legal and not by ethical. When someone doesn't pay for their taxes for 2 or 3 years and they get their house sold out from underneath them by a municipal government only because they didn't know how to work the software that the municipality moved to. That's one example of how we work against ourselves when we're trying to solve some of these bigger problems and make a more just and equitable society where there's a lot more care and compassion, to put simply, just a whole lot more care and compassion.
The second part of this discussion on decision-making has to do with perception. And I'm going to use the example in this case of shooting wolves from the sky. It's something I care about, obviously. It's very important to me. But it's also about what kind of contradictions we create through the hidden agendas that sit behind the decisions and the inability to face the truth and speak the truth and be honest about what's really driving the perception that we're bringing to any particular issue. For example, in British Columbia, where I live, there's been this habit of shooting wolves from the sky. For those of you that don't know, wolves are keystone species. They create the health of an ecosystem, and they play an exceptionally important role. Not surprisingly, humans are not a keystone species. We do not improve the health of an ecosystem. In fact, if anything, we try to manipulate it in ways that have negative consequences because we're applying a linear decision-making process, a reductionist approach to something that has more holistic, more interactions and interrelationships that you can't draw straight lines to. One headline justifies that we're going to call these wolves. The idea was that shooting wolves would allow the populations to increase. Years of research demonstrated that, no, that's not what happened. And so even though that data is there, the solution is to discredit the data. In Yellowstone, they've successfully reintroduced wolf packs and restored the ecosystem. There's a wonderful video on that. I'll try and find it and put it in the video version of this on YouTube. In the UK, they're looking to reintroduce wolves to build up restore some ecological health. One species and 3 or 4 different versions about the importance of that species to ecological health, without actually saying, look, really, what we're really trying to do is protect the interests of, and then list whoever that happens to be. This is where perception and hidden agendas and not being able to have hard discussions shows up in the results of the decisions that get made.
Where does this take us? What's next? I started podcasting because I could see, and big picture thinkers can do this, see something was coming up in the system of life. There was too much exploitation, not enough balance, certainly not enough reflection, to be able to know that when you kill off species that matter to the world, then you're going to lose resilience. It's just a principle of nature. Resilience is made of diversity. Biodiversity is a critical aspect of that. There's things that we can do that will make a difference.
I'm pretty excited because I am reading Hannah Ritchie's book called Not the End of the World. Subtitle is How Can We Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet? And what's interesting about it is it's data-driven, which makes the linear thinkers extremely happy. And it's also useful for balance. We need both. None of this is either or at any point in time. It's both. Yes, and is the way of hooking these ideas up in a simple way. So there's tons of opportunities that she outlines in this book that can be done from a data-driven point of view. If we look at it through a systems-wide perspective, there's always been opportunities to work with that. And when I look at the future of the world, I always reference back to gapframe.org, which was data-driven. It just stopped in 2016. The health of the planet has not gotten better, and certainly geopolitically, it's gotten far worse. This is the place where you could see that if you push on this particular lever, then overall the picture gets better. The questions that are in the gap frame analysis are extremely useful from a strategic point of view for companies that have been thinking too narrowly for too long, asking the bigger questions around how can we move the needle on governance, or how can we move the needle in specific areas. For example, when I did this talk to a company in Greece in 2016, the question was, how can we link personal leadership to a shift in the economy? At the time, the Barrett Value Center just been doing some work on identifying the consciousness and the limiting values of nations. That data was very fresh. This was an opportunity to see the relationship between gender equality and moving the needle on the national economy. Now, that's something you can do at a local level. It's something you can do at a company level. It takes growth on both sides, because anytime you're shifting a role or you're shifting the power dynamic, there's going to be opportunities and a need to adjust certain behavioral patterns, certain ways of seeing. None of this will be easy, and none of this is easy. That's why it's part of leadership. Leadership is not about being attached to an authority position to secure status in an organization. It is about being able to grow, learn, and evolve into your best self, 100%. Whatever decisions we make about going forward, there's going to be two levels that things will happen. One will be causal, that is direct. If we do this, then this would happen. Now, that's typically an assumption that gets made because a narrow lens is being used. Directly causal is something we're quite familiar with because it is predictable. Most organizations reverse engineer outcomes. So here's where we want to be, and how do we get behavior to how we produce it? So in other words, all the ducks need to be lined up. There's buy-in. All of that language is around pointing things in the direction that is expected or desired or hoped for. However, when you're working with indirect relationships, you're working with what's going to surface. Unintended consequences are about emergence. That's different. You're listening for what's showing up. That is not something you can do mentally. It's not something you can do using analytical thinking. It is something you access through divergent thinkers, through nonlinear thinkers who can hear and feel and sense something that if you're thinking too hard or focused entirely on what you believe, then you're never going to pick that up. In designing the future of the world, you need to have a broad lens. You need a very holistic way of doing it, which means putting both big picture thinkers into the room along with the analytical thinkers, because both need to challenge one another in order to put something meaningful on the ground. There's lots of places we can get insight and inspiration into what can we do that will make a difference, that are both causal relationship. You can see the connection between the two, but you have to have the indirect, because that's where the real results show up. That's where the unintended consequences reveal themselves. And that is where you start seeing systemic shifts in very subtle ways. And so how we review this and how we record it and how we document it is going to be a combination of data plus an intuitive insight and instinct. Intuitive insight and intuitive intelligence requires a level of emotional mastery that helps to get all the biases that we like to refer to out of default mode. They might show up if you're under stress. It's not to say you're without bias. That'd be ridiculous. But it's more to say that you clean the windshield. You're not busy throwing mud on it while you're trying to navigate the road ahead. You're doing your inner work. You're always attentive to that. And that's how you can collectively participate in the future of the world. It's a commitment to your own personal emotional mastery, as well as working together socially with others.
In a lot of cases, we've got some transitional work to be done as we move away from pretending we know what we're doing in complex systems to learning about how they work, which is a very different level of commitment. There's no shortage of opportunities for all generations to work together, but it probably is going to take the leadership of the younger generations. And by that, I mean 20 to 45s, people that are coming in with a lot of creativity, a lot of talent, excited, and a vision for how they can contribute and participate. Climate activists would be included. Now, of course, you can go into, oh, climate isn't real, these fires are all pretend, and you can go into the conspiracy theory, or you can go into denial, or you can go into a bunch of other things. But in the end, you're going to have to act on what you feel is right. And that's going to be in your heart, in your intuitive instincts. System one thinking, if we go by Daniel Kahneman's distinction, based on what you care about more than anything else. You can take on any one of these challenges and begin to do work on them. Now, by that, I'm talking about larger issues like biodiversity, poverty. And how do you do that? Well, this is where it gets very interesting. Systems change it's not easy. System change then is going to be some resistance to when you're trying to do something different that pushes against the existing systems.
In organizational change, we sometimes refer to this as the organization's immune system. It's the highest level leverage around beliefs and values, where an organization has a certain belief that this is how it's done, and you do something different, and chaos ensues because the metrics, the measures, the financial structure, whatever is the governing or the dominant governance principal will step in and protest. Sometimes it looks like an executive going crazy because what was expected didn't happen. I did an interview on this in my first podcast called The Evolutionary Provocateur on iTunes. It's an interview with Fred Simon where we talked about how it worked in Ford on a project that they were managing. You can witness it in organizations, and you can witness it anytime you're trying to do something different. And this is why resilience is so important.
I love the quote from Bucky Fuller when he said that the way to design something new is design something new that replaces the old. That makes sense to me. Not easy to do because you've got things like the political system very deeply entangled into social systems and religious. You're going to want to have fairly healthy set of resilience skills. When I look back at my history, my family's history, my dad could see some of the things that governments were doing in particular to destroy ecological health. And he wrote letters. He was an activist. He was a filmmaker. He had about 5 things going on in his career. He worked for himself, obviously, otherwise you couldn't do that. And he went after the law to get the laws to be more sensible when it came to looking after species that we require in order to maintain health. Keystone species, notably humans are not among them. In terms of what to do next, you'll want to be prepared for pushback. I started telling you the story of my father. When he died, he felt like he hadn't accomplished much. He was inducted as a member to the Order of Canada because he'd made all these films on nature and wildlife and brought wildlife into people's living rooms. His work was about helping us all realize that we were part of something bigger than ourselves, part of a system, a living system. I took over his role about 20 years ago when as a kid, you're brought up in nature, and naturally you can see things in nature that you wouldn't see if you were going to school or on your phone. You get a much bigger, more dynamic and interactive picture. What that means is that here we are at another opportunity to shift the consciousness of humanity from base level survival to something that is of higher and greater service. Now, what else is involved in this? I mentioned resilient skills. You need a vision. You need to know what you're going for. You need to know why you want to make a difference in the world, because the how will follow. So if you know what kind of difference you want to make in the world and you aim for that, then more of the pieces start to fall into play. I've met a number of climate activists who are feeling extremely burnt out, who can see a problem and it's being denied by disinformation. The variety of ways in which language has been used as a weapon is becoming disturbing, to be honest. The client activist community could use some love. It could use, because it's not an easy job. And that's where our compassion and our care comes forward. If you want to participate in making a difference in this world, care about something, and care about care about it, and care about it in such a way that you can bring compassion. The definition of compassion that I have on my desk is compassion is the recognition of the interconnectedness of all things. And I absolutely believe that to be true.
Because the issues that we face on the planet are both complex and uncomfortably large, I would like to include in this the points that Hannah made in her book, because I thought she made really relevant points that I certainly agree with. They're important to consider when looking at the future. First, I will say that doomsday is a choice. It's probably definitely harder on the human spirit than stepping up and doing something, but it's still a choice. So bear in mind, you always have options. The first point that Hannah put in her book is we face big and important environmental challenges. Positive trends are sometimes, okay, that's good, we can relax. Nope, not really. These are massive problems, and they're not ones that you can be complacent about. Secondly, because environmental issues don't seem to be our largest existential threat, doesn't mean we shouldn't work on them. This is a reflection of the complexity of life. We think if we can't work on this one dot, if we don't solve this one particular one, then we're going to fail. This is such a big reality with many moving parts that it's important to remember that whatever contribution you make, it's going to accumulate to a larger level. This is where collective intelligence and collective action comes in, where people are working together. You don't have to be working on the same goal. In fact, a goal level is too low. You're looking at the vision level. What's the picture we're looking toward? And even if it's as simple as restoring vital health to all systems, whether they're ecological, social, that's enough. It is a large picture vision you're going for. You don't have to be doing the same things, but you're moving toward a similar goal to create something better. Number 3, you have to hold multiple thoughts at the same time. I will never forget going to the Massive Change exhibit, which was designed and curated by Bruce Mao in 2006, I believe. He had on the wall a whole timeline of the evolution of human technology from in caveman days right up till 2006. What's fascinating is the media did not know how to report it because there were multiple points being made in there. It was a wide spectrum of how do we design the future of the world conversation. The media had no idea how to report because there was not one dot that they could focus on. You have to hold multiple thoughts at the same time, which means you have to have a wider point of view, which means if you're really heavily addicted to analytical thinking, you're going to want to practice perception shifting. You're going to want to shift perspective, change contexts, put yourself in places you're not comfortable in so that you can see more and see other things as well. We have a tendency to think, well, if we don't do that, it's either or thinking, it's binary. It's not binary. It is yes and. Many things can be true simultaneously. You don't have to be absolutely right about each thing. Point 4 in her book is none of this is inevitable, but it's possible. The other explanation I often use for what are we in right now is the bifurcation. We're in a place where the linear design of decisions and institutions is no longer able to carry the complexity. And so it breaks down. It's a natural part of the evolution of systems. I have that on my interview with Ervin Laszlo in the first episode of the Inspirational Insights podcast. Breakdown or breakthrough. So we're seeing a certain amount of breakdown, and the breakthrough comes from a creative solution to doing things differently. So that's, again, a part of choice. Anything is possible. That's really entirely up to us. Complacency is not an option. You can certainly be complacent if you want, but it's a waste of your human and potential and creative talent. And obviously, you're not alone. There's a lot of people out there that are looking to be a part of something bigger, to participate in a way that brings us back into more direct control over how we experience what the world looks like. Certainly, the kind of geopolitical tensions that we're seeing now are a real test for how do you stay emotionally and mentally when you're looking at some very emotionally immature decisions being made that have a massive impact on global health and the future of what the planet looks like. People that are prepared to destroy the planet in order to be right or to feel more powerful. That's the worst possible outcome, and everything else that's better comes from initiative. It comes from people that have vision, what I call visionary resilience. It's being able to see ahead and working towards that. This is the exciting part I see for all of us.
What does the future hold? The future holds what we want it to hold. And that's the small answer. The much larger answer has to do with what are the things that lie well outside of our control, that we pretend we can control, but in fact are not controllable. And that may mean ecological tipping points. It may mean cosmological surprises. It could mean a number of things that are completely off the radar screen at the moment. And the purpose of this episode in particular is to say the future is up to us. And it's up to us individually because you've got to commit and you've got to be willing to do the hard stuff. You've got to be willing to step into doing difficult things because that's going to bring out that human potential. It's going to bring out what you didn't know you had and within you. It's going to give you a challenge that your current skill level can't meet. By working together, we can accomplish things that we couldn't accomplish by working apart or alone. And that's where group resilience comes in, not just individual understanding of how to keep yourself emotionally and energetically and therefore mentally well, but also how do we do that amongst using group, a sense of belonging, a shared vision, a way of seeing things. Well, there's multiple ways to get where we want to go, providing the most benefit as possible. The question around potential, why is it important and why now, has to do with who do you become through the experience you've had? Do you become someone who walks away from difference of view? Or do you become someone who says, hey, I see we have different views on this. Tell me more about that. There's a lot of weaponization of language in today's world. And the only way to find out what people really mean and care about is if you sit down and you break that down in real conversations. You can't do it over text. You can try, but realistically, hearts are in the matter. Hearts are in the exchange, the connection that allows you to sit down and ask these hard questions. Secondly, I would prefer to see a lot of people look in the mirror. I've heard some interesting things about wildlife.
Most recently, we had a dinner on the balcony where I live. While everybody was sitting outside, a raccoon, this little bandit-looking fellow, marched down and stood beside somebody that was there, as in he was just checking in to see how everybody was doing. And the reaction was visceral. It was like, oh, that dirty, filthy creature. The owner of the house is very at ease with animals and very open-minded. However, the guest was not. And so there was a lot of freaking out over how dirty the animal was and just a big, huge reaction. And I mean, first of all, raccoons are extremely clean animals. They wash and clean everything. And secondly, I suggest looking in the mirror. Have we looked at where we put our garbage? Have we looked at how we handle ourselves when we look in the mirror and say, what am I responsible for in this? That question is one that opens up a whole bunch of opportunity and self-leadership. We can understand that everything has a place in the world. This is part of how we exercise compassion, is to understand we're part of the system. Elephants are known for their wisdom, for their emotional richness in their inner world. And yet right now we have a country, Tanzania, that is contemplating allowing trophy hunters to kill the large tuskers that are coming over from the Kenyan side. I understand the logic of bringing in foreign capital, But I also understand that these are species that have a lot to teach us and a lot we can learn from. I believe that if governments can cooperate instead of compete with one another, better solutions can come out. I also believe that if we apply some creative thinking to these kinds of larger questions around how do countries that need foreign capital, countries whose people are suffering from not having basic needs, I think we can find better ways than killing off species because it's convenient and an easy solution. In 2008, I came up with this idea to use a video game engine like Steam, which is a product of Valve, the company Valve, to put large global issues in the center of as the goal, and then invite people from all over the world to participate in coming up with solutions. I never found a way to put that into reality. I just didn't figure out how to gather the team, the right kind of team together, or finance it, or any of those other big, important questions. The opportunity is there for us to collectively and collaboratively noodle on these issues together in such a way that the outlier idea is the one that breaks things open. Large issues that are seemingly impossible to solve are quite solvable when we use creativity, when we use cooperation, and across a wide spectrum of worldviews, and in a way that brings health to multiple layers of life and reality in a given situation. This is something that goes back to the ancients. When we can sit across an animal and when we can understand what they're saying, then we will have attained a level of an evolutionary level of compassion and understanding. Futurist Jane McGonigal wrote a book called Imaginable, in which she reported some research I found extremely interesting. If we look ahead, anything less than 10 years is extrapolation. But at the 10-year mark, something interesting happens in our brains. We begin to look at it as a possible future, as opposed to moving along a linear trajectory. We start seeing things differently. Link in the show notes to download a little worksheet I did. You can also get her book, which of course has got much more detail in it, but I distilled it into something that I thought might be useful to begin to think about. What am I looking for? What do I want? And all futures are important. The Institute for the Future did a simulation in 2008, which was a carbon copy, pretty much, as it turned out, of what happened with COVID. And of course, if you'd been through that simulation, you were more prepared than you would have been if you hadn't been. The purpose of this is to really look at what's possible. What do you see as being possible? What would you like to see as being possible? If you download that handout, I will be using that list to invite people to a webinar where we can begin to play with ideas and gather some together and see what that looks like. I hope that you participate in that because I think it'd be fun, but I also think it would be very valuable to begin to ask oneself, what do we really want here? How can we use the kind of disruption we see in the world, the conflicts that we see in the world, and put that to creative purpose and much better use, including all kinds of thinkers, linear, nonlinear, ADHD, all of the labels placed on people that, when put together with routine thinking, can break things open. Those labels usually hide of very interesting thought process when blended in with the very predictable step-by-step linear thought process can make a radical difference to who we become in the world and what the future looks like. I'm Dawna Jones. I care deeply about this incredible planet we live on. It's an oasis in the galaxy. So we have a unique opportunity to evolve our consciousness and our compassion for all species and contribute positively to the world with the decisions we make. Doesn't matter what your starting point is. You support by liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing because it helps me understand if this content is valuable to you and what you would like to see more of. Thanks for watching. See you next time.